How do you repeat code in Python? So what do I have here is a blog post that I wrote some time ago, and I'm gonna go over the blog post and I'm gonna talk about code examples and the ways that you can repeat code in Python. And this might seem like a simple thing, this might seem like an obvious thing to someone who's very familiar with software development. How do you repeat code? Obviously you use loops, but this isn't obvious to someone who's not familiar with software development and who's very new to software development and just trying to get into building some stuff and learning about coding. And I used to be a person like that. I used to work as a QA engineer and I was just learning Python, and one of the first things that came to my mind as I was working as a QA engineer was, well, how do I repeat my code? How do I, for example, go over some kind of log file and collect information from each line? And to do that, you have to do some kind of code repeat. And one of the simplest ways to repeat code in Python is just by using a range function. You can define how many times it's going to repeat, and then under the for loop, you would place the code that you want to repeat. And just for this example, we can use like a print, and you can see we're printing out from 0 to 4 because in Python things start from 0. But this doesn't have to be just like print. It can also be something complicated, like it could be some kind of function call that you define here, and then you can do something with it. For example, now it's just like it's doing something by default, but let's say we add some kind of modifier and then we do that modifier to the calc function, and then as a modifier we pass in index. Now you will have some kind of dynamic result. Obviously this is also a very simple example, but imagine this is like a log file and you would do some kind of parsing action. Yeah, imagine this would be some kind of parsing action and you would go over some kind of lines and you would add some kind of parsing function. That could also work, but this is like, I'm just giving some examples here. It's not going to be index, it's going to be lines. Now maybe we can use index to get lines and so on and so forth. And let's say we have these 5 lines and then we run it and then print this, and you can see how we went over the default lines, and using the parsing action function we replaced XYZ. And this is just like a simple example of using range, but there are some other use cases where you can you could use range, you could use length together, and this would take the length of this list automatically without you defining how many times it's going to loop over, and we would get a similar result. And also, I would not even recommend using range and length together if you are working with a list like lines. Instead, what I would do is I would iterate over them. You would just simply use for loop like this, and you would go over repeat items, and these would be then lines, and this would be a line. And then instead of using lines index, you would simply use a line in here, and you would get a similar result. So this is like the beginning of what you need to start to work with repeating code in Python. This is how I started, with simple for loops, sometimes using range and length together. Yeah, this is enough to get you started. But I know in coding, it really depends on a situation, and you might need some other approaches how to repeat coding. So let's go over a couple of more examples, and I'm going to share more of what I would use. Sometimes you would need to use certain range, like where it starts from 1, for example. Now we're starting from 1, but maybe I would want to start from 5. The result changes, and there are situations where this could be useful, where you don't want to start from 0, but you want to start from some kind of certain number, but you want to end also with a certain number. What's going on underneath the range function? You should look at the range function as this. You start here, you stop here, and then you can also define a step. So let's say I want to go from 5 to 11, but I want to use step 2. I want to skip some numbers, 5, 7, 9. So let's say you have some kind of situation, you have some kind of list, and it doesn't matter. Right now we are looking at like fruits, but don't look at this as real code example. I'm talking more about what tools can you use in certain situations. In a situation where you have a list with known items or even unknown items, and you want to iterate over that list, but you also want to get index of each item. For that case, you would use enumerate function. See how we get index and then we also get the item value from the list. And all of that is because of using enumerate function. And you can also see that the index starts with 0, but sometimes you don't want to start with 0. Like if you want to display these results somewhere in like a website or somewhere else or in some kind of document, usually you don't start with 0, but in Python things start from 0. So how do you start from 1, for example? Well, you just need to define the starting number here. See, now we start from 1. What if we want to start from 5? It's also possible. Okay, let's look at another situation which is very common, is going over a dictionary in Python. Don't look at this as a real example. Look at this more like a way of doing things in Python. Dictionaries in Python is a very common thing that you will find. And often you need to go over each key and each value in a dictionary. So how would you do that? Well, often I would use just .items on the dictionary in a combination with a for loop, which lets you access each key. This would be key, apple, fruit, and this would be value, the color. And then of course under the for loop, you can play around with the key and the value within each cycle and do some more actions. But what if you want to add index to this? Well, I have an example for that here as well. We go back to using enumerate, but now we pass in a dictionary with items in, and then we get index tuple with the fruit and color, and you can access each item separately under each cycle and play around with that even more. And of course we can add also starting here from 1, same way as before. There are situations where you need to repeat code forever. How would you do that? Well, in that case you would have to use a while loop, which is not something that I use often, but it can be useful because you can combine it with some kind of condition. Of course, in a case where you want to repeat code forever, you're not going to do a condition to end it. You're going to use true here, which means basically that this loop is going to run forever. We can test this out by just running that, and you can see that it keeps on going, but this, I don't want to keep this running because it's just running all the time. Yeah, for no reason. I would use this sometimes in a combination maybe with import time, just doing time sleep 5 seconds, and do shorter repeats. Maybe you want to do some kind of action every 5 seconds and you want to make it run forever. That's a good use case of a while loop and using true together. I remember doing something similar back in the day when I tried to use Selenium and I tried to run some scraping scripts to scrape websites. I didn't want it to stop them at any time, but I wanted to keep them running as much as possible every hour, every 30 minutes, something like that. That could be useful for a very simple script. Like I said, yeah, sometimes you don't want to keep the code running all the time. You want to break it at some kind of point. And in order to do that, you need to define some kind of condition. And in this case, I could give you a simple example here. We could say this is like the beginning, 0, some var larger than 10. This would result to a Boolean value. And if this is true, then we break the while loop, but otherwise it keeps on running. For example, let's add time sleep here, 1 second, and if it's 10, let's say 3. Let it break after 3. I forgot to add an important code part. We also need to increase some var somehow. So I would increase it here by 1. True. See how it ended based on some kind of condition, the condition that we define here. And yeah, we can take here a better example. You don't have to use some condition here. You can also keep the condition here. Instead of using true, which makes the while loop run forever, you could place some condition here. Yeah, it's going to run until 10 and then it's going to exit the loop. Nice, done. Obviously, this is also a very simple example, but then you could base these two variables on some kind of other real things in the database, then the whole while loop and the whole running thing would make more sense. So that's pretty much it. That's all of the examples that you need to get you started to be able to repeat code in Python. And that's more than enough that you need to build very useful things. Yeah, and if you found this useful, you can find more code examples on my blog. If you have some questions, you can find my contact details below and send me a message, and we can talk about what you're looking to achieve as a software developer.